This is 38 special brass that's been fired already. After you fire ammunition like this, the brass is dirty and it's also swollen up from being fired. You cannot reload it until you have cleaned it and also resized it. This segment here, I'm going to show you how I clean it. This is a vibratory case cleaner. This one's made by Dillon Precision, but there's lots of other companies that make them. I've had this one for probably 20 years though. It's given very good service. There is a motor under here that's connected to this container, and as you can see, it's on springs. On the bottom shaft of that motor there is a metal bar connected, and it's slightly offset. It's slightly off center, so that as the motor spins, because it's off balance, it causes this thing to vibrate like this. And in here is the cleaning media. Now, I've used two different types of media. This is crushed walnut shells. You can buy 25-pound bags of this at the pet store. I think they use it for litter for birds. There's also crushed corncob media. I've used them both. I think this might be a little bit more aggressive in its cleaning action, though, so I use this, and also it's pretty cheap when you buy it from the pet store. This is brass polish that I put in there. This is by Frankfurt Arsenal, but you can get this from other companies too. You shake this up, squirt a couple of tablespoons in there, dump in your brass. Make sure you don't put too much in there. That looks good. You can put this top on, tighten it down. Turn it on, let it vibrate for about maybe an hour or so, and when you come back it'll be nice and clean. So now when you're done with the vibratory cleaner, you're faced with the problem of how do you separate the brass from the cleaning media. That's where this device comes in. I also bought this from Dillon Precision. You dump it all in there like that, put the lid down, lock it, and then turn. And after doing that for a little while, you open it back up. Your brass is separate from your cleaning media. Ready to go on to the next step. The next step in reloading this is to resize the brass. Now, some people don't lubricate handgun brass, but I always do. And I like to use this Dillon Case Lube. This is a spray lubricant. It's lanolin and alcohol mixed together. This is the same stuff by Frankfurt Arsenal. It's called Case Lube. But if you look at it, it's the same basically. Even if you look at the container, it looks like it's even made by the same people. So first I count out my cases. Now what I use is these plastic containers that factory ammo comes in. This one says Remington on it. I think this came out of a .45 automatic case of ammo. Each one of these holds 50, so you don't even have to count. All you have to do is just fill up the holes and you know how many you've got. That's 50 right there. So what I do is I shake this stuff up, lay them down flat on a cookie sheet, give a couple of spritz of the lube, roll them around a little bit like that to help spread the lube, and then I just pick them up and put them right back in the holder. And in the process of picking them up and touching them with your fingers, that sort of helps to spread the lube around also. And then after you've done this, let them sit for a couple of minutes until the alcohol dries out, leaving just the lanolin lube. I'm going to demonstrate this reloading process using this press. This is a single stage reloading press made by RCBS. This is called a rock chucker. It's a very simple but very sturdy press. And for low development and low volume reloading, I think it's hard to beat a single stage press like this. The dies I'm using are made by Lee. This is a set of dies for 38 Special. They can also be used for 357 Magnum. There's 4 dies in the set. I'll explain each one as I use it. And there's also a shell holder. The base of cartridges, depending on caliber, are different sizes. So the way they handle that in these presses is they use these shell holders. The shell holder fits into the ram of the press just like that. And then that's sized to accept the 38 Special cases like that. The way these dies, this is the first die. This die has a pin on the bottom which will push out the old primer. There is also a carbide metal insert in here that's ground to a precision diameter so that when you resize the case, this carbide insert squeezes down on the wall of the casing and squeezes it back down to a smaller dimension so that it can be reloaded. This is the first die of the 4-die set. This is the resizing die. It also deprimes the spent primers. These are new casings, so there is no spent primer, but if they were once fired and re-cleaned, they would have a used primer there in the bottom, and the pin under there would punch them out. This is how you resize them. This press has compound leverage, so it's very, very easy to force these up into the die. The next step in the process is to make sure that these casings are not too long. Now, I've never had a problem with pistol cases being too long, so I don't always check the length of pistol cases. Rifle cases, it's mandatory to check those because they do, after they've been fired and resized, they typically are longer than the maximum allowable length. but I'm going to check these just to make sure. Now, I usually use this book right here. This is a Lyman Reloading Handbook. I've got a bunch of these by different companies, but I like this one the best because of the way it's laid out. Here's the page for 38 Special, and when I look on here, I see that it's got dimensions for the casing and also a loaded round. So just looking at the casing, the maximum allowable length is 1.155 inches. I'm going to use these dial calipers. These are made by Dillon Precision. These cases are measuring 1.144 and the maximum is 1.155, so these cases are less than the maximum, so they do not need to be trimmed. But it's important to check that. The next step in the process is to put new primers into the casings. Now pistol primers come in two sizes, small pistol primer and large pistol primer. Which one you use depends on the caliber. For 38 Special, you use the small pistol primers. These are made by CCI, and there's 100 primers to a container. Now, when I open these up, I notice that they're all pointing in one direction, which is good, but they're not always like that. So when you dump them in this tray, this is called a flip tray, and when you put the primers into this tray, some of them will end up face up and some of them will end up face down. Well, to load them, you need them all to be going into the same direction. This tray has some sharp ridges cut into the bottom of it, and when you shake this tray, those ridges grab if they're flipped the wrong way, the ridges will grab the sharper edge and tend to flip them back over the right way. Like that. Now you can see, with the exception of this one right here, they're all pointing in the same direction, which is what you want. Then you take the top, well, let me turn this one up the right way by hand. Then you cover it like this. Then you flip the entire tray upside down like that. And now they're all pointing in the right direction to load into the primer tube. This is a primer tube for the RCBS rock chucker press. One end of it's got a pin in it which keeps the primers from falling out when you turn it upside down. This end has a plastic end on it that's split open on one side, which allows you to pick up these primers into this tube without them falling back out. So the next step is to just load them all into the primer tube like this. You just push down on them and they go up in there, and that little yellow plastic tip on the end keeps them from falling back out. The next step is to reprime the brass with fresh primers. I've put the primer tube into this holder that's attached to the press. I'm going to release this pin, which lets the primers drop down into the base of the unit here. This is the priming arm, which is spring-loaded, and the way this works is when I pull back on this primer arm, it's going to pick up a primer into this cup, and then I'm going to push it forward and I'm going to lower the casing onto that primer pin, and you can see that this is spring-loaded. So what happens is the pin pushes up as the casing comes down, and it seats the primer into the primer hole right there. Okay, I picked up a primer. I'm going to raise the casing, push the primer arm in there, and then lower it down. It takes a little bit of force. You can feel it go into position. Right like that. Here's the next one. Okay, the next step in the process is to flare the mouth of these casings. These are straight-walled casings, and now that they've been resized, the bullets will not fit in there. So this second die is used to put a very slight flare or bell on the mouth of the casing. Maybe just the first millimeter or so of the casing. Now, one thing I like about these Lee dies is that they have these lock nuts with an O-ring in them, and that O-ring puts pressure on the threads there, and so once you find the correct adjustment for these, that O-ring tends to keep it in the right spot. So I usually just turn it by the body, screw it down in like this, and then when you get down near the bottom, just snug it up hand tight and you're ready to go. So this is putting a flare or a bell on the mouth of the casing. So if I take one out now that's been flared and put the bullet on there, it'll fit. It doesn't go in very far, but that's enough to sit it on there in a later stage of the reloading, and the press will then force it in the rest of the way. Now, this die is also designed that you can charge the casing with powder at this point if you want to, by putting that funnel in there. You can run it up, bell the mouth, and then dump the powder in and lower it, and you've got the case charged at that point. Now, I don't use it that way. I like to put the powder in as a separate step, but I just thought I'd point that out. That's one nice feature with the Lee 4-die set. The next step is to adjust your powder measure so that it dispenses the correct amount of powder, the correct number of grains, according to the formula that you're going to use for your reload. Now, I'm using 125 grain jacketed hollow point bullets. If I look in my Lyman reloading handbook under 38 Special, there's a section for 125 grain jacketed hollow point bullets. And I'm using Hodgdon Clay's powder, which is a very popular powder. And I see that the range is 3.2 grains up to 3.8 grains. 3.2 would be a suggested starting load, and 3.8 is the maximum safe load. I'm going to use 3.5 grains. I've got my powder measure set now to dispense 3.5 grains of Clay's powder. Anytime you change the type of powder, you're going to have to readjust it, because these powder measures basically dispense a certain volume of powder each time, and different types of powder have different densities. So whenever you change to a different type of powder, you always have to change your settings, even if it's the same number of grains, because it'll be a different amount of volume inside the measure. There's a drum inside here, and you adjust the amount of powder by turning this knob here, and there's a knurled knob here that locks it into position. So what you do is you do trial dispensing down here, like that. That's what 3.5 grains of powder looks like, and you check it by putting it onto your balance beam scale. My scale is a balance beam type from Dillon Precision. After you dispense your powder, you put it up on your scale, and my hundreds are set to 0, my tens is set to 3, and my 1 grain is set to 0.5. So that's 3.5 grains, and over here you'll see it's on the 0 mark, which means that's exactly the right amount of powder. In this next stage, now that I have my powder measure adjusted to drop the correct amount of powder, my cases have been cleaned and reprimed. The mouth of the casing has been belled out so that the bullets can be started. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to put the casing under here. I'm going to drop my charge of powder into the casing. I'm going to look and make sure it dropped it. I'm going to put it here into the press. This is the third die. This die is a bullet seating die. Now, bullet seating dies can also crimp. They can seat and crimp all in one operation, but setting that up's a little bit tricky, and because I have a separate fourth die for crimping, I have this one set so that it does not crimp. It only seats the bullet. And these bullets are 125 grain Remington bullets. They're semi-jacketed. They have a cantilever on them. So what I'm doing is I'm setting up this die so that when I seat this bullet, it seats it so that the cantilever is right at the mouth of the casing, because I'm going to crimp the mouth of the casing onto that cantilever in the final step. That looks good. So we drop the powder, we check to make sure it's in there. Set the bullet on top and seat the bullet at the cantilever. I always like to check the powder to make sure it drops. Now that we've charged the cases with powder and seated the bullet to the correct depth, we have one more final step. You'll recall that the mouth of this case has a flare on it, so we need to get rid of that flare. In fact, we're going to we're going to bend it the other way. We're going to crimp the mouth of that case down onto that cantilever on the bullet. This is the 4th die in the Lee set, which is used to put the crimp on. By turning this knob, you can adjust the crimp anywhere from extremely light to extremely heavy. I've got it set to sort of a medium crimp. 38 Special is not a real hard kicking caliber, so it needs to have a crimp, but it doesn't have to be a real hard crimp. Now, something like a 44 Magnum, you're going to want to put a pretty good crimp onto it. So when I look at that now, I can see that it's, from the reflection off the case, that it's crimped, got a nice crimp on there. Looks nice too. Looks just like a factory crimp, even if I do say so myself. That is one sweet looking crimp on there. Lee dies. The final step that I do in reloading this ammunition is a quality check. This is a 38 Special case gauge. It's made by Dillon Precision. And the purpose of this case gauge, the interior dimensions have been machined out to precision tolerances to check for ammunition sizes. These cases, or loaded rounds, need to drop freely into the case gauge like that. Okay, that tells you that they're small enough to chamber into a standard revolver. There's 2 more checks you can do. Another check is looking at the bottom of it. The bottom cannot protrude out. It has to be flush or below flush with the bottom of the case gauge, and these are. If you turn it up like this, if you hold it against the case gauge and turn it up like this, the nose of the bullet cannot protrude out from the top, and these do not. So that's good. Those are good rounds that'll chamber in a standard revolver. And these are very inexpensive, and this is much safer than taking your ammunition and loading your revolver with it in your basement and then finding out you've got a problem. They make these for rifle calibers also. Okay, so we're basically done with the reloading. I like to take them and wipe them off because that case lube makes them feel a little bit greasy when you're done. So I usually take them, wipe them off, maybe take a look at the primers, make sure they're flush or below flush while I'm putting them away. These ammo cases I get from Midway USA, and I always label them. You want to label your ammunition, otherwise what's going to happen is you're going to be messing around with different loads and stuff, and the next thing you know, you're not going to know. You're going to pick up some ammo and not even know what it is. You'll know what caliber it is, but you won't know what sort of powder you used, or how many grains, or anything, or how many times the cases have been fired, or anything. So you can buy these labels from Midway on a roll. They're peel and stick. And I put the caliber, 38 Special, a bullet weight Brandon style Remington, 125 grain, jacketed hollow point, powder weight and brand. I cut Clay's, 3.5 grains, primers, CCI. The cases are Star brand brass, and I usually put the date, February 2014. There's also space on here for case length, overall length, times loaded, lot number. Some of that you might use if you're reloading rifle ammunition, but for handgun stuff I usually don't bother. Thanks for watching.